If information alone made people skilled, half the internet would be fluent in Mandarin, play the piano, code software, and have six-pack abs. Instead, most people know a surprising amount and can do very little, which sounds harsh. But think about it. Millions of people have watched videos about investing, very few invest. Millions have watched videos about fitness, very few are fit. Millions have watched tutorials on learning languages. Most still panic when someone says hello in that language. The problem is not intelligence. The problem is that most people misunderstand what learning actually is. They think learning means acquiring information. Learning actually means changing your behavior. Those are completely different things. Knowing how to drive and being able to drive are not the same skill. One lives in your head. The other survives contact with a roundabout. And once you understand this, something interesting happens. Learning almost anything becomes dramatically easier. Because the process is surprisingly similar whether you're learning chess, guitar, coding, football, cooking, public speaking, or a new language. Different subjects, same mechanism. Most people approach learning like tourists. They collect information, take notes, watch videos, read books, highlight paragraphs, create color-coded systems that look impressive enough to qualify as interior decoration. And then they wonder why they still suck, because information is not the goal, performance is the goal. Imagine someone wants to learn football. They watch match analysis, study tactics, memorize formations, listen to interviews with elite coaches. After 6 months, they can explain football beautifully. Then they step onto a pitch and immediately lose the ball to a 13-year-old. Why? Because explanation and execution are different skills. This is where most learning breaks down. People confuse familiarity with mastery. You see this everywhere. Someone watches a video about a concept and thinks, that makes sense. Their brain interprets this as, I've learned it. No, you recognized it. That's not the same thing. I recognize what a Formula One car is. That doesn't mean Red Bull should hand me the keys. Learning happens when retrieval starts, not consumption. In other words, the moment you stop looking at the answer. Think back to school. What felt harder? Reading the chapter or taking the test? The test. Because the test required retrieval. Your brain had to find the information without help. And here's the weird part. That struggle is exactly what creates learning. Most people avoid the struggle because it feels uncomfortable, which is like going to the gym and avoiding heavy weights because they're heavy. That's literally the point. The difficulty is the training. Imagine trying to learn Spanish. Most people spend months listening to lessons, watching videos, reading grammar explanations, collecting vocabulary lists like they're preparing for a linguistic apocalypse. Then someone asks them a simple question, and suddenly their brain sounds like an old laptop trying to open 47 browser tabs because they practiced recognition, not retrieval. The fastest learners constantly force themselves to remember. They close the book, hide the notes, and try, even when they fail, especially when they fail, because every failed attempt tells the brain, this information matters. And that brings us to the second thing people get wrong. They think repetition creates learning. Not exactly. Useful repetition creates learning. There's a huge difference. If I watch the same basketball tutorial 100 times, I don't become a better shooter. I become a person who has watched a basketball tutorial 100 times. Very different outcome. The magic happens when repetition includes feedback. Attempt, mistake, correction, repeat. That's the loop. Every skill on earth works this way. Cooking, golf, programming, public speaking, everything. Imagine learning to cook. You could read 20 books about steak, learn the history of steak, study the chemical structure of steak, watch documentaries about steak. Or you could accidentally burn 3 steaks. The person who burns 3 steaks learns more. Because reality gives feedback, and feedback is brutally honest. Reality doesn't care how motivated you are. It doesn't care how many videos you've watched. Reality only measures performance. This is why the internet creates an illusion of progress. You can spend 5 hours learning about a skill without ever practicing it, and your brain feels productive because information entered the system. But nothing changed. It's like reading travel guides for Paris for 10 years instead of booking a flight. At some point, you need to leave the airport. The best learners understand this. They spend surprisingly little time consuming information and surprisingly large amounts of time interacting with it. They test themselves, use the skill, apply the concept, build something, explain it to someone else. Because they understand one simple rule: the brain remembers what it uses and forgets what it doesn't. Which makes perfect sense. Imagine your brain as a company with limited storage space. Every day, millions of pieces of information arrive: names, facts, conversations, random advertisements, embarrassing memories from 2014. The brain can't keep everything. So it asks a simple question: are we using this? If the answer is no, it gets deleted. If the answer is yes, it gets strengthened, which means the secret to learning almost anything isn't finding better information. It's creating more usage, and that's where things get really interesting. The biggest learning advantage isn't talent, it's exposure. And most people massively underestimate how much exposure they actually need. They expect to feel competent after a few hours, which is strange. Nobody goes to the gym 3 times and asks why they aren't stronger. Yet, people spend 2 weekends learning a language and start questioning whether they're naturally bad at languages. No, you've just met reality. Skills take reps, lots of them. And think about driving. The first lesson feels impossible. You're steering, shifting gears, checking mirrors, watching traffic, trying not to hit a cyclist, and wondering why humans decided this was normal. A year later, you're driving while holding a conversation and barely thinking about it. What changed? Not intelligence, exposure. The brain loves efficiency. Anything you do often becomes cheaper. Anything you avoid stays expensive. This is why the fastest learners aren't necessarily the smartest people in the room. They're often the people willing to be bad at something longer than everyone else. Most people quit during the awkward phase, the phase where you're good enough to notice mistakes, but not good enough to avoid them, which is unfortunate because that's exactly where improvement lives. Imagine learning guitar. The first few weeks sound less like music and more like someone fighting a metal fence. That's normal. The mistake is interpreting that struggle as evidence you can't learn. The struggle is evidence that you are learning, because learning is adaptation. And adaptation is messy. The final piece of the puzzle is something almost nobody talks about. Learning works best when you create output. Not input. Output, a simple test. If I asked you to explain a topic to a 12-year-old, could you do it? Not repeat definitions. Actually explain it. Because explanation exposes weaknesses immediately. The moment you try teaching something, all the gaps become visible. Suddenly you realize, wait, I thought I understood this. This is why some students spend 10 hours studying and remember nothing, while another student spends 2 hours learning and 30 minutes explaining it to a friend. The second student usually wins, because explanation forces retrieval. Retrieval strengthens memory, and memory creates skill. The entire system feeds itself. This leads to a surprisingly simple formula. Learn, use, test, explain, repeat. That's it. Not because it's magical, because it's how the brain decides what deserves permanent storage. Most people search endlessly for better methods. The best learners spend their time getting more repetitions. It's similar to football. The same principle applies to nearly every skill on Earth. Coding, writing, sales, languages, music, business, cooking. The medium changes. The mechanism doesn't. And once you understand that, learning stops feeling mysterious. You stop asking, am I smart enough? And start asking, have I practiced this enough? That's a much better question. Because one depends on talent, the other depends on action. So if you want to learn almost anything, stop treating knowledge like a collection hobby. Stop accumulating information like a squirrel preparing for winter. Use it, test it, struggle with it, apply it. Because the people who learn fastest aren't the people who know the most. They're the people who interact with what they know the most. And once you understand that, almost every skill becomes learnable. Not easy, not fast, but learnable. And that's a far more useful superpower than talent ever was.